One of the elements of this conspiracy that they pointed to was people had the phone number for jail support and mutual aid written on their arms, which is like super conventional at protests now. It has been going back to 2011, at least. That's the first time I saw it like sort of en masse during Occupy Wall Street in New York. And the reason people do it is because police scoop people up. This isn't like paranoid. This isn't criminal, right? Like this is like completely normal behavior. And it's a situation that's actually been created by the government. So that effort to protect each other being characterized as an evidence of a crime is, you see that again in Prairieland. It's just then they threw the terrorism charge on all of them. In Cop City, they also tried to charge them as domestic terrorists and use that narrative. But those cases have started to fall apart.
Todd Blanche, is that the fucker's name?
I believe so.
So, Christine, today we are going to talk about a group of activists in Texas who have been collectively sentenced to over 450 years in prison for going to a protest at which a police officer got shot.
Some of them weren't even at the protest.
I would say this is one of the scariest cases, attacks on free speech in American history, and we need to talk about it.
So, Kate, who are we canceling today?
We are canceling the Prairieland excessive prosecutions.
Yes.
Hey everyone, I'm Katelyn Burns.
And I'm Christine Grimaldi.
And you're listening to Cancel Me Daddy,
the show where we take a closer look at all the panic around political media.
With thoughtful analysis.
And verbal shitposting.
Christine, we have a big one. One of our most important episodes, I would say.
One of the ones that's terrified me the most.
Yeah, so we have a very special guest and mutual friend of ours, Melissa Gira Grant from the New Republic, who has done some fantastic coverage about Prairieland. This is something that we wanted to talk about for a while, and finally, now that the vacations and summers are all over for us, we are finally getting into it.
And I think it comes at a really prescient time. Todd Blanche was just confirmed by the Senate, what was it, like 4 o'clock in the morning over the weekend, something like that, as Attorney General. These prosecutions have mostly, or if all, predated him, but things are going to get scarier with him, if that's even possible.
Yeah, and we don't talk about him too much in the interview, but just to let you know, like Todd Blanche is all on board for these excessive prosecutions where you had 8 people sentenced to 450 years in prison. He said, the sentences handed down today make clear that Antifa terrorists who attack law enforcement and federal facilities will face swift and uncompromising justice, said Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, who is now the confirmed Attorney General of the United States. Their violent extremism has no place in our country, and the Department of Justice will continue to aggressively investigate, disrupt, and prosecute those who threaten law enforcement officers or undermine the rule of law.
Well,
so that's what we got. Todd Blanche is the big bad of the episode.
I think it's a really important listen because we can learn how to support the defendants and each other.
So let's get into it with Melissa. Melissa, welcome to Cancel Me Daddy.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. It's incredible to finally be here with you both.
Yeah, for sure. So we wanted to have you on to talk about your ongoing reporting about the Prairieland cases, and this is something that I've been kind of following from afar. I haven't looked too closely until we decided to cover it on this show, but like we said in the intro, like it's a terrifying case on multiple levels, not least of which like it's like a test of the government's power to regulate speech, political speech, basically. But all of this started from a protest, essentially. So can you walk us through like what happened on the July 4th noise demonstration at the Prairieland Detention Center that kicked all of this off?
Yeah, it's a terrifying case, and it touches on a lot of different issues, both, free speech, freedom of assembly, and also sort of like what the Trump administration is telling us about who they think is a criminal at the bottom of it. we first hear about this case, I think pretty much the morning after. The way it's initially reported is there was an attack on an ICE immigration facility, and 3 federal officers were shot at, and there's charges of attempted murder for half a dozen people or more. Very slowly, over the ensuing months, it becomes clear that that is actually not what happened at all. What had happened was, in the days leading up to July 4th, 2025, in the context of all of these like national demonstrations against the ICE occupations of cities, like Los Angeles was really going off at the time. A group of people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which, doesn't have like the biggest activist scene, and it's somewhat disconnected, but there are certain like hubs of this scene, and a group of activists, some of whom knew each other, some of whom didn't, some of whom had never gone to a protest before, some who were old hands, had a meeting to discuss what they wanted to do to sort of, there was like a daytime protest at the Prairieland Detention Center that was more of a just sort of like standing signs and chanting and, like a very sort of conventional, like in the vein of No Kings. I think the No Kings protest that just happened. And they wanted to do something different. They wanted to do a noise demonstration, which is not something they invented, to be very clear. Like this is like a very established kind of protest, usually anarchist inflected, if not like put on by all anarchists. And they tend to target like prisons, jails, detention centers. And they're meant to not just sort of like issue dissent with people being locked up, but to also like be audible to the people inside. And so the people inside, sometimes you can see them in the windows, like holding up their hands or flashing the lights like in their cells. Like it's meant to like not just sort of express a sentiment, but to actually like be there for people who are held in terrifying conditions when it comes to Prairieland. So they show up, not a big deal. They have brought fireworks with them. It's the 4th of July. Again, like not unusual for a noise demonstration. They've got bullhorns, they chant, wave a flashlight around to kind of get the attention of the people in the detention center. Officers who work at the detention center come out, ask them to leave. Most of them do. At some point, a 911 call was made that triggered local law enforcement to the scene. If that had never happened, we would never have heard of the story. Like that would be the end of it. When local law enforcement from Alvarado, Texas arrived on the scene, allegedly the officer exited his car, gun drawn, and there were 2 protesters that he could see. And one of them was armed with a rifle and wearing a neon green neck gaiter. And that protester, Benjamin Song, interpreted the officer's stance and weapon being drawn as a threat to the other person, and so fired. It is in dispute sort of what the point of the firing was. Song's attorneys say they were actually aiming at the ground, and they were trying to sort of create what they called suppressive fire to like distract the cop or throw him off. I don't know whether or not that would have worked, but what ended up happening was a bullet did hit that officer. No one disputes that Song fired their weapon. Song also uses he and they pronouns. And, Song ultimately was the only person convicted of attempted murder. But in the beginning, they tried to charge everybody who was there with the attempted murder of federal officers. And the way that they did that, first on the scene, scooping up as many people as they could, as soon as it went out on the radio, like an officer was shot, there was like tons of law enforcement were on the scene.
Yeah.
So a bunch of people got arrested that day, but then they continued raids on people's homes. And by the end of it, 22 people had been arrested and charged for their alleged connections to this protest.
I think the sort of headline that I've been seeing about this case is somebody got like 50 years in prison for moving a box of zines. So can you like talk about what happened there and like how the government ended up like making a case?
Sure. The sentences came down in June. some others in July. They came care of, I think one of your favorite judges on the federal bench, Reed O'Connor. This is all happening in his district. He didn't actually oversee the case. It was another judge in the same district. Yeah, just a long resume of incredibly fucked up things that this man has done. So his buddy oversaw the case. And both of them, gave out sentences, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years in the case of Benjamin Song. One of the people who got a 30-year sentence was not even there at the protest, but his wife was. And when she called him from jail, freaked out, not knowing what was going on, at some point before or after that call, he went to her house where he had also lived. He sometimes lived with his parents also. And the government turned that into trying to destroy evidence or obstruction of justice, like some sort of like criminal conspiracy with her. And, it's so preposterous. Like one of the things they were talking about was their pets, like being left alone. No one thought they were going to jail that night. No one had like a plan. And why would they?
Yeah.
And so at one point, the government tried to turn a conversation about bunnies and feeding other pets as if it was code for some sort of criminal conspiracy. So this is where we get the 30 years for moving a box of zines. Des, who got that charge, his wife, Mariela, who got 50 years. She was actually at the protest. It's all to sort of like build this story that the government was trying to tell. They refused to acknowledge that it was a protest. They call it an attack. And they latched onto both these zines and also 3 other individuals who ran an anarchist book club called the Emma Goldman Book Club. And between the zines that Des allegedly moved and between this book club, they somehow created this like anarchist boogeyman. And linked that then to this idea of an Antifa cell, which did not exist. So in a way, like I saw some pushback to this framing of like, well, he didn't get like 30 years. Like that wasn't an attack on free speech. He didn't get 30 years for moving zines. He absolutely did. And it's an attack on free speech, not in the sense that no one can get those zines. Like, in fact, Firestorm Books in North Carolina is selling them. You can go get a package of them sent to you if you want. But it's because they were using political literature to allege a conspiracy for this whole group of people. And it is absolutely an attack on speech.
Of all these kind of, ordinary actions that people take, tactics that have been used time and time again, what's the scariest that the government is going after? Not to rank them, but like what really has like the most implications for people?
Over time, like I mentioned, like the story kind of changed that the government was telling about it. So when it started out, it was like an ambush on an ICE detention center, and then it became an Antifa cell. But they were ultimately charged with material support to domestic terrorists, which is a wild charge.
That's wild.
And the way that the government gets there is if any of these people made an agreement to be at this event where things that are elements of how the law defines terrorism happened, and those need not even be violence, that could be vandalism. In this case, it was. Then that means anybody who knew that, assented to be there and like could have had any reasonable idea that these things could have happened, that constitutes providing material support to terrorists. The government doesn't need to prove that there were terrorists. Like there's no terrorists in this case. At no point do they point to someone and say, this person's a terrorist. They don't have to, the way that this law is written. And that's incredibly scary. We have a similar but different case going on right now in Spokane, Washington, where, they're alleging a conspiracy existed because 2 people were at a protest and both got arrested. And they're trying to upgrade that just from like disorderly conduct, which was originally how it was charged, to a conspiracy to impede and injure a federal officer. It's a pattern that, we have seen in other cities. And I think whether or not the domestic terrorism charge comes with it, that's what enabled people to go to jail for decades. But just this idea that like people at a protest, that constitutes a criminal conspiracy is chilling. And, we're seeing the government's intent to do that and to sort of redefine protest as, criminal behavior.
I mean, this could have a chilling effect too on even mutual aid efforts in cities or towns or whatnot.
Absolutely. Some of the folks who kind of saw this coming, both activists and also other journalists, like had been looking at what was going on in Georgia over the last few years with the efforts to stop the Cop City, like $90 million mega complex for training police. And there was a huge different groups of activists who came together around this, whether like environmental justice activists, indigenous activists, abolitionists, faith leaders. And at one point, the government claimed that there were 60 people involved in a racketeering conspiracy, that their activism counted as that. And one of the elements of this conspiracy that they pointed to was people had the phone number for jail support and mutual aid written on their arms, which is like super conventional at protests now. It has been going back to 2011, at least. That's the first time I saw it like sort of en masse during Occupy Wall Street in New York. And the reason people do it is because police scoop people up. This isn't like paranoid. This isn't criminal, right? Like this is like completely normal behavior. And it's a situation that's actually been created by the government. So that effort to protect each other being characterized as an evidence of a crime is, you see that again in Prairieland. It's just then they threw the terrorism charge on all of them. In Cop City, they also tried to charge them as domestic terrorists and use that narrative. But those cases have started to fall apart.
I mean, I remember writing my editor's phone number on my arm covering, protests while covering Congress, because again, the cops will come in and just take everybody away. I never got arrested, to be clear. Like, I would be there and the cop would say, "Do you want to get arrested?" And I would say no. And they're like, "Okay, go over here." But not all cops are like that. Like, that's just Capitol Hill police who have to deal with protests constantly. So
yeah, it's like a situation that journalists who cover protests all the time, like, also have that firsthand knowledge of in ways that like maybe jurors in this case didn't understand. And then the government kind of plays on that, right? They play on this fantasy that people have of how the police work. And you would never get arrested if you didn't commit a crime. You'd never get arrested at a protest if you weren't doing something wrong. And, it's so important, I think, to like tell stories like that and make it clear, like, we don't have control over whether or not the police arrest us in those situations, including people who aren't participants, including people who are journalists.
And you said in your ongoing coverage that this case was made from the top down. Can you talk about some of the administration officials who were involved and how incoming AG Todd Blanche might affect the landscape going forward?
There's some people in the DOJ none of us should ever have heard of, like, just to start with that. Like, these are people who should like not be in political positions. Like, we should not be scrutinizing the activity of, the parts of the Department of Justice, for example, that supervise the 94 different U.S. attorneys' offices across the country that, are now bringing these cases. So like last year, around the time that things were getting really hot in the streets in Los Angeles, and protesters were doing a pretty good job of making ICE's job difficult for them, whether that was like publicly shaming them or like getting in the way of arrests, and, behavior that we've seen like be very effective in the ensuing months, whether we're talking about Chicago or Minneapolis, Memphis, New Orleans, parts of DC that have been essentially occupied by ICE. Like, this is something I think that the government saw and freaked the fuck out about. Like, they're like, people are actually willing not just like stand up and hold signs, but they're willing to actually like put themselves on the line, whether that's as a witness or as, legal support or as just a pissed off neighbor. Like, that, people are mobilized in a way that like I've never seen anything like this. And so I think this is a political response. It's not a criminal response. It's a political response to that. So we get this memo last June, about 2 weeks before Prairieland. And it comes from Associate Deputy Attorney General Akash Singh, who we also see, his name pop up in these other cases like Prairieland and other cities, as maybe he's like an intellectual architect. That's maybe giving him too much credit. He's like the guy who's willing to put his name on this as a strategy. That's like at least what he is. So he's like, this is very weird for like somebody this high up in the Justice Department to be parroting rhetoric that we hear from Trump and Stephen Miller and Tom Homan, their border czar, and like whoever the fuck is on Fox that day, and like Ben Shapiro, and at the time, Charlie Kirk. This sort of rhetoric that, like, what is actually going on, as Singh called it, was rioting, looting, arson, destruction of property, assaults on officers, and obstruction of federal immigration enforcement. So, this is how they're characterizing protest, which sometimes have involved vandalism, which sometimes have involved getting in the way of federal immigration enforcement. But these are not things that have drawn these kinds of charges before. And certainly like nothing that like resulted in this level of like coordination from the Justice Department. So he instructs the U.S. attorneys across the country, aggressively go after these cases and be sure to push out press releases whenever you file charges in these matters, he says. This is not about the Department of Justice identifying a problem and going after it. I mean, I hope people aren't that naive. This is like the Department of Justice basically saying, like, we're going to help sell Trump's policy of mass deportations. And we're going to help repress the response in communities that are outraged by this, that are trying to protect their neighbors. We're going to raise the stakes so that any of them could end up with like really serious federal charges.
I think my question is, you mentioned earlier that other cases that are similar to this are kind of falling apart. And not just the political speech ones, but just the overly political prosecutions that we're seeing, with DC Sandwich Guy and the Broadview 6, even the Reflecting Pool. And you mentioned Stop Cop City. One thing I want to do is draw a contrast between all of these, and especially Prairieland and January 6th, actually. And the reason I want to do this is because January 6th, there were a lot of, I guess the kind way to say it is conservative groups, but like fascist groups who organized for January 6th. There's evidence, the zip ties, and, there's plenty of evidence of this, right? And we see the way the Trump administration has like bent over backwards for them, wholesale, what was it? It wasn't a commutation. It was pardons for everybody involved in January 6th. A lot of them now have jobs in the Trump administration. And also like the Trump administration tried to create like a victims fund for January 6ers. Oh, so there's a complete contrast here between the way that the Trump government specifically is pursuing these charges against, leftist activists for, quite frankly, not criminal activity versus actual criminal activity being just let go as long as it's pro-Trump or, pro-fascist. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
January 6th is a really interesting, important, terrifying, horrifying parallel with Prairieland for a lot of reasons. Like, these cases that the government, the Trump administration has tried to bring against protest and demonstration and dissent, a lot of those cases have fallen apart just because like they reached way too far. And they, reached for charges that have not typically been used in this way. They, in the case of the Broadview 6, apparently engaged in grand jury misconduct, where like they just kept drawing new jurors until they could get the jury that they wanted and left a record of it. At the end of the day, these are not very bright guys, and things got out of control, as Watergate it's taught us all, or at least all the president's men has taught us all. Like, they're not that good at this, which like shouldn't make people feel better, because like, trust me, they're going to keep going for it.
Yeah, it's like intellectual architects, but
they're just going for it. There was one guy in Los Angeles, Bill S.A. Lee, who like tried to go after ICE demonstrators, one who gave out people face shields to protect themselves, and tried to call that like some sort of criminal conspiracy. Like they're reaching for crazy shit. Like and crazy in this context meaning like dysregulated, disordered, like no record of this having been done before. And like a rational lawyer would look at this and be like, why are you putting your name on this? Like, seriously, like, why do you, like, typically prosecutors get a grand jury to indict whoever they want, right? This is like why the sandwich guy was so funny, right? You can indict a ham sandwich. Well, apparently you can throw a ham sandwich also at someone or whatever that sandwich was. I don't know if we found out for sure, but like it is, like this is really weird that we have like cases falling apart like this. Prosecutors do not like to bring something to court that they don't think they can win, at every level of the legal system. So that's why things like the sandwich guy and the reflecting pool are just like so obviously nakedly political prosecutions, right? They look weak to everybody. They even put Trump allies like Jeanine Pirro in these like bent positions of sort of like, going as far as she can for Trump, and it's like still not far enough for him. The difference with January 6th, I mean, one, we had a Justice Department run by different people. I mean, some of these people were like still federal prosecutors, like typically federal prosecutors, it's not a political appointment. We don't see an entire office like getting flushed out and cronies being put in, but we also had turnover in prosecutors' offices from people who felt like they were being told, like in the case of the Spokane 3, which is very similar to Prairieland, prosecutor there quit rather than bring these charges. We haven't seen a lot of that, but I think it's telling that we're seeing that. And then he's actually come out very vocally against that case. So they're pushing at the limits of what the Justice Department is willing to do. And in a way, January 6th also is a test, right? Like what kind of cases can we bring? How much coordination do we have to like prove? Who are the masterminds? Like, and ultimately, like a lot of those cases, the charges like weren't nearly as wild as these. We were seeing, property destruction or obstruction of government administration. Sounds really boring, but, it could be everything from standing in the way of a cop who tells you not to move to like, I don't know, trying to prevent the election results from being certified. Like those weren't all violent, but there were a lot of cases of violence that were charged. And this is, there were also people like the leader of the Proud Boys and the leader of the Oath Keepers who actually were charged with far more serious charges. But that was, sedition. That wasn't domestic terrorism. And I think there were some cases, I don't know off the top of my head which one there were, but people who are more experts in this particular terrorism law that's being used in the Prairieland case have looked for other examples of it being brought. And it just hasn't been brought very much. Were there federal prosecutors who looked at the January 6th case and said, can't we bring domestic terrorism here? Or should we, because prosecutors are sort of conservative that way, we'll go for what we think we can get. Or maybe we'll like raise some scary sounding charges to try to get people to flip and cooperate. And then we'll go for the lesser charge. Like that's like the normal and still fucked up state of play for federal prosecutors. So what we're seeing in Prairieland is they're just going for it.
There's a duality in that, right? Because they want to win for their record, but also because it sets precedents. So if there are acquittals, then it doesn't bode well.
It's really terrifying for the Prairieland case on that level, because I think they're in a position right now where like probably the only thing that's going to give them any relief, and not justice, but relief in the legal sense, is if a future president pardons them or commutes their sentences, does for them what Trump did for January 6ers. And that isn't to draw an analogy between what they did and what the January 6ers did, but to say that like at this point, this is not a legal system that is going to, like they've already gone so far, where it's going is the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, who are just like responsible for all kinds. Yeah. Like, come on, really?
It's a clown show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like
and the clowns are scary.
They're scary. They're scary, and they have a record of being like, "Tell us how MAGA to go for you, we'll do it." Like we're happy. Like, one of the things that some of the folks who've been working on the support committee for the Prairieland Defendants were telling me is there is this tension where people like see this as this extreme miscarriage of justice, and it is, and then think it's something exceptional. And it's like, well, extreme miscarriages of justice actually happen in this system all the time, and define the system. It's not an accident that like the judge in the Prairieland cases in the midst of that gets a visit from Bill Barr just to get a tour of the courtroom is what they were told. And Bill Barr's interesting because he wouldn't go as far as Trump wanted him to, but, this is a small Federalist Society world. Like the judge in this case, I think was like one of the founders of the Federalist Society in that part of Texas. They're all buddies. There doesn't have to be a conspiracy, right? Like they're just buddies. They all like are there for each other, scratching each other's backs. It doesn't mean that something went wrong in the system. This is when the system is built this way, like this is what we ultimately get. The scariest thing, which I don't think it's gotten nearly enough attention, is like this was not a war on terror era law. This was not post 9/11. This was post Oklahoma City. Bill Clinton signed it. Joe Biden supported it. This is a law that's just sitting there waiting for someone to run with it and do the worst. And it's been sitting there for 30 years. And here we are. There are finally some prosecutors who are willing to use it in this way.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because Oklahoma City, I mean, obviously, like the Turner Diaries was a heavy inspiration for Timothy McVeigh. So, like, I can see from that one case, like some potential value to it, but also it could be weaponized really easily. And like, I look at this as like a 44-year-old millennial and being like, I don't know how to tell my children that this country wasn't like this when I was their age. Like, we did not see cops with long guns. We did not see cops with tack vests back in the day. They had like light blue uniforms and maybe a 38 on their hip. We did not have TSA even.
No, we didn't have ICE.
We didn't have National Guard wandering in packs of 4 around my city.
Yes. Okay. So Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought that up, Christine, because I wanted to rant about that.
Let's get into it.
Yeah. So I have been following this kind of closely. Even though I was on vacation last week, I was still reading about this because I can never have fun. I was reading that now the Trump administration wants to build permanent housing for the National Guard units that are patrolling D.C., and the order for them to stay in D.C. is now extended to his inauguration day. And to me, and maybe this is just me being conspiracy brained, I don't know. I don't think it is. To me, it's clear that it's like they are trying to prepare for a mass uprising in the nation's capital. If I was planning to pull something to stay in office, I'm sorry, I brought you into this, Melissa, but
no, it's okay.
If I was planning something to stay in office, post the next person's inauguration day, this is what I would be doing, right? Like, there's not really a purpose for the National Guard to be there. Christine and I were walking around the National Mall a month ago,
checking out the algae before they started arresting people.
And but the National Guard members are just sitting there scratching their ass all day, like literally doing nothing. And I can't help but think that they're expecting some sort of violence that they feel they need to be protected against. And to me, like, these charges are part of that project where they're trying to discourage people from even organizing in the first place.
Yeah, don't apologize for bringing me into it. Like, I'm in New York. We've had National Guard on our subway for different reasons for a while. People seem to have forgotten about it. We have cops standing around doing nothing all the time, and like,
no, they're playing Candy Crush.
Yes, the degree to which that's been made normal is like so hard to even, like, you were saying, like, how would I explain this to, like, that it wasn't like this when I was a kid? And it's like, I don't know how to explain it wasn't like this 2 years ago. It wasn't like this 5 years ago. It wasn't like this 10 years ago. I just saw a documentary last week called WTO 99, and it's about the WTO protests in Seattle at the end of 99. And, that's been on my mind a lot doing research on Prairieland. I think that was my introduction to, like, the scary stereotype of the black-clad anarchist. And, like, at the time I was at UMass. Wait, Katelyn, were you at UMass in 1999?
No, I was still in high school. I was 3 years from UMass.
I was in the middle of undergrad, and I was taking this class in the department called Social Thought and Political Economy, or STEPIC. It was basically like the Marxist department, but slowly I realized that when I enrolled in an anarchist seminar that was co-taught by students, because it's an anarchist seminar. And so 2 weeks before Seattle, I gave a presentation on less lethal weapons and when is political violence acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those were theoretical conversations 2 weeks before Seattle. And there have been other, like, attempts to suppress other movements that have engaged in property damage. Like, we've saw this with the Green Scare and a wave of laws criminalizing protest around defending animals, animal rights, like environmental justice, like that got kind of weaponized with Cop City as well. There's something that's been building, but it also feels really different right now. I think that's like a hard sort of line to carry, where it's like, what's happening now is scary in a very different way. There's a group of people who are completely unhinged and have turned the Justice Department even to a more nakedly political entity. At least in the past, they had the decency to pretend they weren't political. Now it's like, it's all out. We have like a top content producer running the FBI going around crowing about like these Antifa cell that was defeated. We have like a bunch of terrifying clowns. And that is really different. And it's really scary then to be like, well, now like this thing that we've built over the decades, like this anti-terrorism law, they can just reach back and bring that forward and weaponize it in ways. And like, that's what I keep kind of coming back to, of sort of like, how do we make this right? Like, how do we explain this to people? Like, that's going to take some people being like, you know what, we were wrong. We were wrong. We overreacted. Like, we don't have to actually charge this as some special crime. This was mass murder. This was orchestrated. Like you do need to tag it with this ideological label, which is what it is. To tag it terrorism. It's violence. Is that not enough? It's murder. Is that not enough?
I wanted to know if there was, I picked up in your coverage, if there was a married couple. They appeared to be in a same-sex marriage. So I just wanted to know if there was any embedded homophobia or queerphobia, which we have seen so much throughout the administration in going after the Prairieland folks too.
I want to do like a whole piece just on this. I haven't published the full extent of like sort of this part of the story, but It is there, it is obvious, and it's gross. There is the house that the prosecution was obsessed with, that they described as like a commune, was just like a big queer activist house. I think it was even nicknamed Big A House. Like I interviewed one of the defendants' wives, Lydia. Her wife Autumn is doing 50 years. Another defendant also lived in the house. I briefly talked to her wife as well. There were polyamorous relationships. Like there were like lots of trans folks up and down the case, disproportionate by far to the number of trans folks there are in the DFW area. And that's not unique to Prairieland. Like two of the three Spokane 3 are trans and non-binary. Like there is something going on. Like I know people freaked out a couple of months ago when we first learned about the Presidential National Security Directive 7 and other documents that were reported as sort of like redefining trans people as terrorists. And it didn't go quite that far. Like the what it was doing was sort of like associating, I think they called it like gender ideology and being hostile to traditional family values. Like it was trying to sort of scoop in actually a much broader group of people and saying like, these are belief systems that you see within Antifa, which we are telling you is a domestic terror organization, which there's no such legal designation for that. So I don't know what to make of all of that. Is this your normal garden variety homophobia and transphobia? Is this something else? And we don't have the full court transcript, but the Prairieland Defense Committee, the support committee, took very careful notes during the trial. And from the transcript I read and the notes that they read, they definitely tried to like, as Lydia told me, like the prosecutors made it look like much weirder than it really is. Like just, stigmatizing a group of people who are basically broke. One of the people was arrested in her Panera work uniform. Is it that surprising that in South Dallas, there's a group of trans and queer people who are living together because they can barely survive? That's unfortunately like super the norm. And the government ran with that.
I was reading your coverage of this case, and it felt like 5 of my friends all have living situations like this. Like it is not that unusual to have people coming and going, and you're gonna shack up with people with similar politics more often than you're not going to, especially if you're trans. Like you can't just live with anybody in Texas as a queer trans person. But one thing I think that the case unintentionally does is show you what a fraud the claim that Antifa is a centralized terrorist organization is, because there is no big Antifa. Like there's no there's no president of Antifa. It's just people. It's just people, and they're arresting people for just normal people activities, right? And yes, you can say like the officer should not have gotten shot, and the person who did it, in a normal legal environment would be charged with that. But to go after everybody else that was around and like vaguely involved and like their spouses who weren't even there, it's just gross. It feels un-American to me, to be honest with you. Not to get all like patriotic lib here, but it really pisses me off.
It's like McCarthyism gone wild, to be quite frank.
It's like all the Red Scares happening at the same time. We got 1919, we got the 1950s.
McCarthy would be like, "Oh, this might be going a little too far."
Yeah, it's like smear the queer at this like level.
Yeah.
One of the defendants' partners was telling me, like, look, like, I don't think there's a tension in saying we expect the United States to like live up to its values, and like we aren't surprised that this happened. Like those are both true. And like we don't, like, we can expect better, we can demand better, we can, push for that world. And I think it's so clear to me that the case that the government ran with of Antifa terror cell was constructed by fascists and fascist sympathizers. Alexander Edwards, who I talked with for a piece about sort of the ways that folks' support networks have been criminalized, she mentioned in an essay that I will link to in one of my pieces, like it's a fantastic essay at her site, Hotel Florida, where she talks about like the government's expert that they brought on Antifa, who's like part of a think tank that the SPLC designated a hate group, who was saying things on the stand like, well, just because they didn't say these things in text messages doesn't mean that they didn't happen because they're that good. That's what Antifa does. And it's like, are you kidding? This is like Salem. This is like spectral evidence. Like, what are we doing here? So like the people that these folks as individuals, there is no big Antifa, as affinity groups, as neighbors, as partners, the things that they were organizing against, it's those people who build the case. And now it's those people who are in the government. And it proves the necessity of what they were doing. And I think that's the dimension of this that's like most obvious, but also not, because we have so many kind of fictions we tell ourselves about the legal system. Like it doesn't, clearly something like this couldn't happen. It's a huge miscarriage of justice. It's like, it is a huge miscarriage of justice, but like, brick by brick, we've sort of built this system to get ourselves there. And, every transphobic bullshit thing that people let pass, like this bullshit Trantifa thing, like, right. Like all of the monstering of anybody who is an accused school shooter, the rush to sort of to claim that person's trans when they're not, like this years of building up this like boogeyman about trans people, about anarchists, about Antifa, like it all is just sort of coming to a head in this case. And I can't pretend that like I saw it coming, but like I saw the elements. I just, didn't think they'd go as hard as they did.
What a terrifying thought to leave off on.
Yes.
Can I give a more optimistic
yes, please.
Little,
thank you.
button on it? So Bruno from the DFW support committee, what he told me they're engaged in right now is sort of like building the movement that they need to free the Prairieland defendants. And like knowing that movement is going to have a lot to do, everything from like raising money for legal support, taking care of people's families, like, primary breadwinners are in prison right now for, there's kids and elders who are like in the lurch because of this. People aren't getting their medications. People are being held in the wrong facility for their gender. People are experiencing huge hardships in prison that like they need direct support to confront that right now. And also, if we are going to build, like, if the aim here is a pardon or commutation from a future president, think of the public pressure that's going to take, and then think about like, well, what would it take to build that? And so that's what they're working on right now. And I find that like incredibly optimistic because like no matter the outcome, like we need to do that. Like we need to have this conversation about these terrorism laws. We need to have this conversation about the demonization of trans people. We need to talk about the way that Antifa has been weaponized. Like there needs to be like a public consciousness shift around all of that, because that might be what it takes to put pressure on a president. You know, I could see a Democrat trying to run the fuck away from this, right? Depending on how things go.
It's the favorite thing to do.
Yeah, like so what is it going to take? And I find that like actually somewhat exciting to like imagine like what would it take? What would it take to get us there? Mm-hmm. What can we do to get us there? And it also makes it feel a little less overwhelming too.
Well, there was that dichotomy that you've talked about in your coverage, right? That people were deliberately not sharing their names or contact information, which made it harder to find those who were incarcerated afterwards. So there also really does need to be this collective coming together if any change is going to be made.
Yeah, like it became so clear to me that like the way that these political cases function is to break people apart from one another, to make them distrust each other. I mean, we could have seen that from like, you know, the history of COINTELPRO and things like that. But like it's very clear in this case, like you had people who were just like terrified to reach out to each other because they didn't know if a raid was going to hit them. Bruno didn't know if a raid was going to hit his apartment just by trying to find people. And that like those risks are real. They're very real. And to see people sort of figuring out ways to come together despite that, like that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as the sentences have. And probably the people who are doing it would rather us pay attention to the sentences. But that's part of it. I mean, I don't think the media would be talking about this case in the way that they are if not for the work that the support committee did to put it on people's radar. So they need all the support they can get.
Well, Melissa, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's long overdue to have you on here, to be honest.
I'm a long time fan, like OG Cancel Me Daddy, like back in the day, you know, when Christine came on, I was like, oh my God, it's like, I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. So we'll link to all of your coverage on this in the show notes, but where can our listeners find you to keep following you going forward?
I'm hanging out on Blue Sky too much. My handle there is at melissagiragrant.com, and my website is also melissagiragrant.com.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or subscribe to us if you are an audio listener. Also, Christine, I couldn't help but think of you when we talked about the text messages about taking care of the bunny at home.
Yeah, that really disturbed me because as a bunny parent, that is not code for anything except we have to get more hay to feed the rabbit.
I would fly to DC to feed your rabbit.
That's really sweet. Thank you.
Although I think I would get arrested before you would. I don't know.
Oh, God. We got to protect us.
On that note, if you want to support us, the best way to do so is on Patreon or by becoming an Apple member. And with that, you can get access to all of our bonus episodes. You can now get Cancel Me Daddy every week through Patreon or through Apple memberships. And here is a sneak peek on next week's bonus episode. I think she is just inherently like conservative politically. She's also aging and getting towards the end of her career and might have an eye on what she wants to do next. She's also skinny, conventionally attractive, and blonde and white, which makes her particularly attractive for right-wing media.
Yeah, the pipeline, we've talked about the cancel to grifter pipeline before.
Yeah, there's also a pipeline between mediocre, blonde, white female athletes and making a living as a transphobic bigot, as we've seen with Riley Gaines.
Sure is.
Riley Gaines has started going to Sophie Cunningham's games. Anti-trans activists are recruiting children to go hold signs at games.
Oh, God.
They're demonstrating in front of arenas now.
This is very reminiscent of the anti-abortion movement, especially recruiting children to stand outside clinics holding signs, or for the annual March for Life, having busloads of kids come down from Catholic high schools all over the country. Another example about how anti-trans and anti-abortion activism go together. Bodily autonomy is paramount.
But the recent escalation, and the one that makes me so angry is two former NBA players, Enes Kanter Freedom. I remember when he was just Enes Kanter, by the way, and Royce White, who are both just old men at this point, older men, long past their playing days. They have announced themselves to be eligible for the WNBA draft, claiming that they're coming out as women only in a basketball sense in order to play in the league.
What assholes.
Cancel Me Daddy is a Flytrap Media production, and today's show was made by me, Caitlin Burns, and my incredible co-host Christine Grimaldi, along with our editor May Schultz.
Dee Peterschmidt made our theme song, and Romy Tirico designed our graphics. Transcriptions by Heather Langefeld. Ads by Multitude Productions.
Our show is made possible by the incredible cancelers supporting our work, especially the members of our Canceler Hall of Fame, with the great power to cancel all of their enemies. Meg.
We appreciate your support.
Happy canceling.